We're now going to move into the first of our plenary sessions for the conference. The first session is sponsored by CropLife Canada, and they've given us a very generous donation towards our conference. What I would like to do is ask CropLife's CEO, Pierre Patel, to come and introduce our first speaker. Pierre?
Thank you very much, Morris. My name is Pierre Patel. As was told, I'm President and CEO of CropLife Canada, and we're the trade association that represents the plant science industry in Canada. Our industry takes great pride in developing technologies that help farmers here at home and around the world. That's where we align with the Global Institute for Food Security in our determination to help feed the world through transformative innovations in agriculture. When we make progress on this goal, we help alleviate the problems that arise from cyclical poverty, like lack of educational opportunities, political instability, illnesses, and premature mortality. And yet, despite that fact, that agricultural innovations make such important contributions, we're often faced with the challenge of convincing a skeptical public that these innovations are not only necessary, but are contributing to a greater good. This afternoon's first speaker, Dame Anne Glover, promises to have some interesting perspectives on the intersection between science and communications. A highly respected scientist and entrepreneur, Dame Anne Glover has used her background in biochemistry and molecular biology to establish a distinguished career in scientific research, which includes working to promote science communications. Such has been the impact of her scientific contributions that she has been conferred the title Dame, the equivalent of a knighthood, for her exceptional achievements. And although today is my first opportunity to meet Dame Anne in person, comments she has made in the past as Chief Scientific Advisor to the European Commission have certainly caught my attention. In particular, her views on the misuse of the precautionary principle by some EU countries, as well as her firm stance on the safety of GM crops, have genuinely resonated with me. Today, Dame Anne will share with us her thoughts on what knowledge is needed to address global food security and how to take that knowledge into the public policy realm in order to improve people's lives. Please join me in welcoming Dame Anne Glover.
So, Pierre, thank you very much indeed for that very kind introduction, and also to Morris for the invitation to join you here at this conference. I must say, I've never before visited a country where you're actually welcome to the country when you get off an international flight, as I was yesterday at Edmonton. It was, I had to ask the guy to repeat what he just said. So I thought, that's amazing. That speaks awfully well for a country, so it's lovely to be here. I want to talk to you about making the best use of evidence, and it's going to be a bit of a hybrid presentation, because I'm going to talk about what we need to do as scientists, as people who generate knowledge, and what our obligation is to make sure that knowledge, reminding ourselves that most of the knowledge that we generate is paid for by the public purse. So citizens pay us to do what we really love doing, and we have an obligation to ensure they get the best value for that, and we can do that in a number of ways. So in some ways, the talk will be a little bit like a call to arms. But I also want to talk about some specific examples of taking knowledge and using that in a way that really matters to people, that really changes their entire access to good food, nutritional food, and also independent living. So first of all, let me start with something which is, you might find a bit gloomy. So many of you will know that in the UK we're having a little local difficulty at the moment. It's called Brexit. And in the referendum about leaving the EU, some of our very prominent politicians, one in particular, said something that was a bit shocking to me, because he said people in the UK have had enough of experts. And I found that quite hard to swallow. And it reminded me a little bit of this quote here by Martin Niemöller, who was a Lutheran pastor, and he was in the 1940s speaking out to German intellectuals. And he said this, he said, first of all, they came for the socialists, and I didn't speak out because I'm not a socialist. And then they came for the trade unionists, and I didn't speak out because I'm not a trade unionist. And then they came for the Jews, and I didn't speak out because I'm not a Jew. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me. And that's why, as scientists, we need to speak out on behalf of evidence. Now, it's going to cheer up from here on in. So what happens if we decide not to use evidence? It's actually no laughing matter. There are severe consequences, and I've mentioned just some of them here. If we ignore the very compelling evidence and scientific consensus, and I'm going to come back to scientific consensus, about human impact on our climate, then we are going to suffer very badly in the future. If we, in our case, well, let's just think about the financial crisis that was a global financial crisis. There was ample evidence to tell us it was going to happen. And actually, as another downer, I can also tell you that there is existing evidence to tell you it's going to happen again. But do we pay attention to that evidence? No, we don't, because short-term gain overrides our ability to look into the future and to protect ourselves in the future. So here are just some examples. If you ignore evidence, it's really important not to do this. So what we can do as scientists, because we're in a very powerful and a unique position in that we are outstanding, or have the potential to be outstanding, at translating evidence. Because sometimes evidence is a bit complicated or hard to really translate effectively for a broad section of the population, and also for our policymakers and politicians. So I'll just remind you of a favorite film of mine. The one on the left here is Lost in Translation with Bill Murray and Scarlett Johansson. Any spare time, watch it. It's really good. But it's about two people, and there's a lot of misunderstanding because they're not really communicating. And this isn't the reason it's my favorite film, but it did remind me of the time when I was chief scientific advisor for the then president of the European Commission, José Manuel Barroso, because often we were talking at cross purposes, because it was hard for me to understand the pressures that he had in translating evidence into policy. And I know that on a number of occasions he would say to me, well, that's fine, you've convinced me, but how do I go about convincing the heads of 28 member states? And I could see his problem. So this is where we are, is thinking about how we translate evidence. So think about evidence, because it's not just a single thing. Where does the evidence base come from? What's credible evidence, what isn't? How do we deal with uncertainty? Because as scientists, we love uncertainty. And I'll remind you that politicians hate uncertainty. So already we have a communication challenge. There are many who want to misuse evidence for their own ends. And there are consequences to that misuse. So I'm going to talk about some of these things. But first of all, to remind ourselves in generating that evidence, that knowledge, we are outstanding at doing this. And I've given you a number of different areas, whether we're looking at oceanography, neuroscience, nanotechnology. There are a whole number of areas where it's unbelievable what we know about the world in which we live, and in fact, our place in the universe. So we generate amazing amounts of very high quality evidence. And we also have something very special that we do as scientists and researchers, and that is that we come together to generate global infrastructure which allows the best in the world to come together and to work together to solve big problems. And this is one of my favorites, and I was lucky enough to go to the Atacama Desert in Chile and to visit the Very Large Telescope, which is run and operated by the European Southern Observatory. Now, it's a fantastic infrastructure, but I'd have to say they're not very imaginative when it comes to naming infrastructure. So VLT, and I would, for those of you who don't know, they're building an even bigger one 25 kilometers away from this. And any guesses for thinking what the name is? Well, it's the Extremely Large Telescope, or the ELT. So all the imagination goes into the science here, not into the naming of the infrastructure. But why this is so special, and we heard already today about science doesn't have boundaries. It's what makes it so attractive to me. It's an international language and an international pursuit. And it's wonderful that we can come together, use technology, and deliver knowledge. What do we do with the knowledge? Well, it allows us to tackle the really big global problems. And there are a number here, whether it's looking at the increasing frequency of health epidemics, looking particularly in the developed world at the aging population, thinking about sustainable energy, sustainable food supply, looking at natural disasters. All of these things require us to be smart and creative to be able to address them. And in fact, we also have the possibility of innovation. So innovation is delivered from that knowledge. It allows us to think completely differently about something that's very traditional. And I've chosen an example here of using satellite imagery with color enhancement to allow us from a satellite network to look at the health of crops down to a very small, a high area of definition on the ground. So this is fantastic because it can allow us to be smart about agriculture. It can also, this is looking at the health of vegetation. It will also help us to look at the potential for diseases, crop diseases and pests, and how they might propagate over countries globally. So is all evidence the same, though? Because I talked a bit about generating evidence, but people don't often or always interpret it in the same way. And I just want to remind you of this man, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, from Irish descent, but he was a US senator. And he said a thing that is worthwhile remembering, and that is that we're all entitled to our own opinions, but we're not all entitled to our own facts. So that's something that we, as scientists or researchers, have to stand up for when people are misusing the facts of the matter and are generating their own evidence or their own alternative facts. And if we don't stand up for it, who else will? And I'll tell you why we've got an important voice. Now, here's a slide you never thought you'd see at a Sustainable Agriculture Conference. And I'm using this just as an example to remind you that it's often, as a scientist, I remember somebody talking to me about living in a local village cooperative and that we could all bring our own skills to that cooperative. And I thought, well, I don't really have any skills, I'm just a scientist. And you tend to forget what your own skills are. And we are absolutely excellent at interrogating information. So I just mentioned this as somebody popping up with something that on the face of it looks quite convincing. And I'm going to use this. No, I can't. Looks quite convincing imagery on the right, which was a piece of cloth which apparently had this image of it, where people thought that this was definitely the Shroud of Turin. So radiocarbon dating and various other technologies were used to analyze it, and the material was found to be medieval, therefore could not really have been the Shroud of Turin. And this is what science does. It allows us to interrogate and to test, and it's really, really valuable. The other reason it's valuable is because actually, as scientists, we're really trusted. And I want you to have a look at this slide, and now I can use the new technology. So whose evidence do we trust? Trust is really important because actually, unlike many sections of the population, you are all trusted. So this is in the UK, and if you look at the 5 most trusted professions, then nurses, doctors, teachers, professors, and scientists. So there's a high level of trust that we enjoy. And there's an obligation comes with that. If we're trusted, we should use that trust. We're trusted for a good reason, and I'd say that we, by and large, deserve that trust, and therefore we need to start using it. Who isn't trusted? Well, I guess I'll put up the Hall of Shame there. Some of this is very unfortunate, and actually, let's just take the bottom 2. That really upsets me because I go out and vote for someone that I want to represent my views. And yet, as soon as they're elected, I just don't trust them. And that's a bad place to be. And I'm going to finish by telling politicians how they could be more trusted. I'm sure you have your views as well. I just thought I'd have a quick look and see if I had any data for Canada. And here's the Insights West. There's also a similar Ipsos Reid poll on trust in Canada. But actually, it's not so different. You'll see, again, nurses, doctors, scientists. But why this is interesting to me is, farmers are up there. So farmers are really trusted in Canada. And it strikes me that where I'm living in Canada, and I was a scientist, and I was interested in agriculture, there's a very compelling partnership there to be able to get things done in an evidence-based way. So quite impressive. Society gets its evidence largely from journalists. They didn't fare too well in that trust poll. And it's a bit of a pity in a way because we get most of our evidence, most citizens will get their evidence from journalists. They don't get it from the scientific literature or by speaking to you. So we need to think of a way of how we can add into this mix in order to get journalists having more scientific information at their fingertips. And I notice in the audience Fiona Fox will be in a session tomorrow, and Fiona heads up the Science Media Centre in the UK, and that's actually been transformational in bringing together expert scientific voices as soon as something happens that journalists can then access and get information from instead of just making it up when they write articles. And so this is a really valuable way forward. So if we want to tackle the biggest global issues, we must use all the evidence that we have. And as we are trusted, then we really have an obligation to do something. So let me just give you one example. I'm a trustee of 2 organizations. One is CABI, the Center of Applied Biosciences International, which operates globally. The other one is the African Agriculture Technology Foundation, which operates mostly in sub-Saharan Africa. But this is a CABI example. And apologies, I couldn't get the CABI logo on this slide, but one of the things that CABI has done is to understand how agriculture happens, in this case, predominantly in sub-Saharan Africa. And it happens because people talk to each other, they share information, it's smallholder farmer, And so they set up a project initiative called PlantWise. And so the farmer has some diseased plant tissue, they have a problem, they go along and see someone, let's call them the plant doctor. The plant doctor has a knowledge bank, and they can quickly look, they can take an image of the affected tissue, they can go into a database, and they can then tell the farmer what the issue is. Now, this is a very valuable and sensitive way of being able to approach the problem. It's not just spray or do whatever. It's tailoring advice in a way that is very easily acceptable. That knowledge bank is it's open access. Anybody, you can all go and have a look at it. It covers over 2,500 crop pests. I won't read it all out. You can see it there, but it's incredibly powerful. And also, if the plant clinic is too far away from the smallholder farmer, then she or he can use their smartphone, take an image, and send it and get a remote diagnosis. This really works. The scale of the program is substantial. So you can see the number of plant clinics established, the number of plant doctors trained, but also the number of farmers who have reached almost 10 million, which is not insignificant. So this is an example of what you can do using essentially ICT technology. And again, I'm not going to read through all of this, but it allows us to use technology and make it easily accessible and translates our knowledge from the generation of knowledge into real solutions, which is essentially excellent. It's what we should want to do. We're having a competition here. So this is an example of what we can do just by harnessing technology in a different way and being a little bit more creative. I wanted to give you this example, and this is an example from AATF. So AATF, the African Agriculture Technology Foundation, and I know there are a few in the audience who know this. We have somebody from AATF here, Sylvester Oike, who's, I think, contributing in a session tomorrow. Your very own Stan Blade from University of Alberta, who's a fellow trustee, and Jennifer Thompson, who was a former trustee of AATF. Now, why I'm putting this up is because I wanted to show you that the knowledge that we generate, if we think about how we pass that knowledge on, is utterly transformational in people's lives. So here's the story of Mrs. Masungu. So Mrs. Masungu, her old home on the left, she was part of something that CABI runs, actually, called the Rural Outreach Program, or is involved with. And she has 1.5 acres of land. And she normally harvests 7 bags of maize from 1.5 acres, a bag being about 90 kilos. And that just about keeps life and soul together for her and her kids. Just about, but it's a struggle and a worry every year. So we provided her with AATF with the seed for some water-efficient maize. So this allows her to address problems with drought. In the first season that Mrs. Masungu had that maize, you can see on the right that she had 60 bags of maize from the 1.5 acres. So she went in one growing season from producing 7 bags to producing 60 bags. And she sold 55 bags of the maize, and she built her family a new house. And she used the rest for education and for diversification of what she did on that land. Now, it's important, remember her name, Mrs. Masungu, because she's a real person like you and me. And the knowledge that you generate made her life unbelievably different in a good way and transformed the life of her children. And because of the Rural Outreach Program, which was set up by an amazing woman called Ruth Onyango, that outreach program where women who are the bulk of smallholder farmers speak to other women and tell them, yeah, I used this seed, it was great, look what's happened to me. And you can imagine that Mrs. Masungo's friends are having a look at Mrs. Masungo's house and thinking, do you know what? I want some of what she's got. So it's a very good way of being able to accelerate technology transfer. So that's the good news. The bad news is that not everybody wants to use evidence, and not everybody interprets evidence in the same way. Sometimes people are partial in their use of evidence, and we all have unconscious bias. We need to think about that. Many of us have vested interests. So, distortion of evidence. People do distort evidence, but it's very easy to do this because of unconscious bias. So if I just show you this image. Now, you will have immediate thoughts when you look at this. And if I told you something really unpleasant about your Premier, Justin Trudeau, and I told you the very same really unpleasant thing about the US Premier, President Trump, who would believe the nasty thing about Premier Trudeau? Just stick your hands up. He's not watching, so you can, yeah. There's always one, and I know who you are. But so generally, people will feel, oh, you know, he's, particularly in Europe, we think he's wonderful. That's not generally what people think of President Trump. So if I told you a nasty story about both of them, you wouldn't have any evidence, but your unconscious bias would think, oh, I don't think Justin Trudeau would do that, but I bet Donald Trump would. So you just think somebody's told you, somebody that you work with that's really not thought to be a very nice person or a bit aggressive, and you say, oh, it's terrible, you know, they just had a stand-up fight with somebody in the parking, by stealing the last parking space, compared to someone you really do like Morris here. Now, can you ever imagine him fighting over a parking space in front of the university? Any hands up? Oh, there's nods for that, Morris. I'm sorry about that. But I'm just mentioning it because we all suffer from this. It's not something that people other than us suffer from. We all suffer from it. And we should remind ourselves, and I certainly do. GM crops was mentioned by Pierre in the introduction. And I have to remind myself to read papers which say this is an interesting technology and can provide valuable options with as much scrutiny as I would read a paper saying you will die if you eat GM crops. Because the tendency for us as scientists is to put much more scrutiny into that latter paper rather than the first one, so we need to guard against it. Cherry-picking evidence. This is actually quite widespread, so I'm giving you two examples here. In the US, 31,000 scientists signed a petition saying climate change isn't happening, or human-influenced climate change is not happening. But yet 100% of the world's global scientific academies say to us they're in complete agreement that actually yes, it is happening. And interestingly, 100% of the charitable NGO organizations also tell us that there is a scientific consensus and that climate change, man-made climate change, is happening. Now that's interesting when you look at the second one. In this case, only 310 people signing a petition. This might be a little out of date, but not much. Signing a petition in Europe saying that there is no consensus on the safety of GMO technology to produce new crop species. But yet again, 100%, every single global academy that's looked at this and looked at the evidence says that the technology is safe. And the NGOs in this case say, well, there isn't any consensus, so until it's proven safe, we can't do that. Well, you all know that we can't ever prove anything is safe. I can't prove to you that drinking a glass of water is safe. So it's a bit of a mischievous argument, to say the least. And I'm mentioning this because cherry-picking evidence is very, very serious. And who should talk about it? We should talk about it. So scientists, I would argue, can play a key role, and this is from another favourite book of mine this time, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams. And in that, there was a thing called the Babel Fish. This is a little diagram of it. And it's an interesting thing, the Babel Fish, because if you pop the fish in your ear, it translates every species in the universe, so you can understand what they're saying. And I see scientists a bit like that. We are the kind of universal translator. And we have the ability to be able to translate sometimes quite challenging, difficult, nuanced evidence into something that really matters for citizens, policymakers, politicians to understand. And so we sort of have an obligation to do this. How do we ensure that evidence matters? How do we do it? We need to communicate what we do and why we do it. Why do you do the research that you do? Why should someone pay for it? If you don't have an answer to that, I would be worried. You need to demonstrate the relevance of what you produce to a very broad audience, not just your peers. They already know how good you are. We need to speak to the media, and we need to speak to them relentlessly and carefully, and in a way that helps them to be able to do our job or be partners in our job of translation. And we must speak to policymakers or politicians. They are just like you and me, or at least they were originally before they went into politics. So no, I'm joking there. They need your input. You need to talk to them because you are trusted by the public, and it's good to remind them of that. We do need to speak to the general public, and we need to speak to the NGOs, the non-governmental organizations or charitable organizations, because they enjoy a degree of trust, not as much as scientists do, but they do enjoy trust also from the public. They're often seen as an unelected voice of the public. We need to speak a language that everyone understands. So just imagine this is what it might be like to be a dyslexic. I know we'll have some dyslexic people in the audience, and you see things differently. And so we need to think about how we translate what we do so that it's relevant and compelling for people. We also should remember about our own limitations, and we should be honest. We should be honest about what we know and what we don't know. And we should talk about that in plain, clear-cut language so people understand that where we really understand something or where we need more evidence before we could give a degree of comfort. So an important role there. We need to show empathy for public concerns. So I know that certainly if I was in the UK and I went out and I just asked people, oh, would you like maybe to think about eating some genetically modified crops? People would say no, they don't think they would like to do that, and they feel very uncomfortable. Partly because it's often dubbed as Frankenstein food, that doesn't sound too appealing. And I think also because they don't understand a basic thing, and right across Europe, so 500 million people in the European Union, there was a survey done, not of the whole 500 million, but of a representative cross-section of those people asking about their thoughts about GM technology, because it's widely rejected in Europe. And the main problem is they said, I don't know what's in it for me. I know what's in it for the big agricultural company. I can see maybe what's in it for the farmer, but what's in it for me as a citizen? So we need to have empathy for that and think about how we talk about things in that context. The other thing we must do, coming to a close now, is that scientists need to raise their voices when science is being misused. And so this is a newspaper on the left-hand side, the Daily Mail. I use the term newspaper with a degree of latitude. So They published this a few years ago, and for me it just typifies what should make all of you immediately pick up the phone, put pencil to paper, write an email, write in a complaint, is because they said global warming stopped. And, you know, here the Met Office in the UK, they've actually published this data. So you can see it here on the left. I'm going to have a go at this again. So you can see it on the left-hand side with some delay that there's a small part of that graph which is, if you look in the context of how global warming actually is seen, then you can see that that little section is up there in the right-hand side. Now, nobody in seeing all of that data would ever say that global warming has stopped. But it suited the paper's owners, who knows what to publish like that. And your average person who's busy, is thinking about a lot of things, is not going to look at that in their copy of the Daily Mail and think, do you know what, I must go to the library or search the internet tonight to see if that's actually true. They will just say, apparently it's, you know, the Met Office says that it's no longer happening. So if you don't act, it's not meant to happen. If you don't act, who will? And think about that. Because everyone normally thinks, so someone else is going to do it, not me, because I'm too busy in the lab or doing my own things. If you don't act, nobody else will be able to do it. And you're trusted. So you need to act. And the last slide goes to, in a way, the politicians and something that they should consider, because we should ask our politicians to be transparent about the evidence that they use or they don't use in their legislation and policy making. Now, if a politician came to you and said, well, we're thinking about legislating about, I don't know, use of chemicals in agriculture, and they told you what evidence they have, and then they said, well, we're going to use some of the evidence, but not all of it. And here's the reason we're not using all of the evidence. And I have very good examples of where me as a scientist thinks we should have a policy that ignores the evidence. I'm not going to tell you that. I'll speak to you afterwards about that. But there are very good examples where you would ignore the evidence because we live in societies, other things are important to us, so we have values, and science also has values. But if they did this, this might address partly this problem that politicians are not trusted, because they need to trust us with the evidence and accept that we are mature and that we can understand the reasons why decisions are made and when evidence is used and when it's not. But if you have a very cavalier attitude towards evidence, then I would argue that we're all lost. So that's my call to arms to you. Stand up and be counted, and insist that evidence is used or poor evidence is corrected by you. Thank you very much indeed.
Anne, let me thank you once again for opening our conference. I think you've given us some really important messages and maybe some onerous responsibilities in terms of our scientific communication. But I think one thing we have begun to learn, I think, is the solidarity amongst the scientific community is something that will eventually pay off. I think it was Churchill that said science should be on tap but not on top. And I understand that is, you know, one of the problems in politics, but we need to make sure that tap is wide open and flowing.